Charlie 3, 10-4.
Taking over the chip 1 exit.
Hotel on Weber. Patrol 2 or I'm 4 or 3.
I don't know. Hold on.
As soon as somebody clears up. 4 ways. Gang 1. I'm not far from there. I'll assist you.
I'm 10-4. It's gonna be in front of the store.
Ending is 38.8.
Okay. 10-4. Charlie 210, 38.8, 10-4.
Yeah, that.
No matter, clear and taking half of the call. 10-4. Charlie 3, show you clear?
Charlie 310, I'll be clearing out with 330.
Hey, I don't know what happened to that system.
Gang 1 and Gang 90 have to show you clear as well.
I saw it on request, so I gave it to Route 11 because she's going to be down that way. Route 29, you copy?
I'm here. I'm close. Well, I'm down the street from him.
Then let me give it back to you. Hold on. That's what I'm trying to figure out with the
Do you know what she was last seen wearing?
Okay? I couldn't figure it out. I didn't know what to do with it. Hold on. What time is it on your manifest?
It's at 1322. It's going to be 1300.
So I'll be clear. I'll be around the phone.
10-4. It's going to be 2 male subjects. One has a bat. They're both Hispanic male, shirtless, short. And the one without the bat is a Hispanic male, blue and white. They heard one button-up shirt with blue jeans and stuff.
5077, St. Travis.
Clear. Gang 1, go ahead.
Medics just contacted subject. He's alright. Clear the other units.
Contact the subject. He is alright. Clear the other units.
Beginning mileage is 53. Gang 1, I'll be clear.
Gang 1, 10-4, clear. Charlie 310, Charlie 330, clear.
340, clear.
340, clear.
It's a welfare check. On who?
Bravo 320, the RTA.
Justin Wayne Bloodworth.
Bravo 320, 10-4. It's going to be a disturbance with a Hispanic male and Hispanic female. Male pushed the female to the ground. Male has no shirt and khaki pants. Female's wearing a pink shirt and blue jeans. They were last seen on the sidewalk. Yes.
For the male subject, he jumped in a vehicle, then jumped out at the stoplight. He's supposed to be wearing a gray collared shirt. Stand by, I'll get you the description. That's alright.
For Charlie 3, can we close? E7798.
I'm sorry, number 17th Street. If we have a history at this house, is there a phone number? Can you call that? See if we got an answer. If we get an answer, ask us to come to the front gate. Now we got 440
Has a white truck with them, a company truck that says Carver on it, unknown clothing description, possibly blue jeans and a work shirt that says Carver.
Adam 360, 10-4. Adam 450, 10-4.
10-4, show me en route to the northwest.
4, whichever you want. I got 2 1500s going to Gonzales and to Timber Grove. Can you pick it up?
Staples in Maryland, King Sam
I don't know,
John,
Doc. I can
396.
just put them on the...
Make a note, I stopped them at Staples and Coast Guard initially.
Staples and Kosar initially at Staples in Maryland. King Sam John 396.
Just let you know that is my subject, but nobody's going to pick him up in the state of Texas.
Arrive in multi-site 7. Can you put us on the other call in this area with the CPS lady?
Number
10-4, I have a passport. That's fine. Can you run a serial number for a 29 for a gun?
RB decline contact.
Sheila is in a Volkswagen Jetta. A different female was in a Volkswagen Jetta, possibly chasing the subject.
Is it black? 470, which color is it going to be?
father told him to kill himself. Father left in a gray truck. The adults are inside the residence. Adam for 30 clear.
Yes, you can clear 309's part and put me on that call. SDID 07.
SDID westbound, agree with 10-4.
David Paul 9, X-ray William Edwards.
I'm out with 47.
310-10-4.
230 Consorts and Foley.
6 seconds behind the leader central and the church back here.
21. Back, service return. Bar 450, bar 460, suspicious person. 829 McDonald, 829 McDonald area. RP decline contact.
Ready, transfer your...
4, Charlie 330, X-ray clear.
Charlie 360, no one for contact.
Can have 50s en route to location.
That's 10-4, decline contact.
Never, I'm not seeing anything anywhere. Please wait.
Clear traffic.
Andy 10-4.
Ladder 15.
Right disturbance pending, 4738 Easter, 473 Easter. Make contact with Teresa Moya.
46. Take a suspicious person on the element.
340 and 360 are en route.
And I'm going to give you something else because I need
340
your
RG
help.
continuing with Charlie 320 for the disturbance. Charlie 360 RG.
Route 30.
Okay. Charlie 375, 10-4. Charlie 330, 10-4.
Ears and 18.
275.
Do you have another,
do you have an impound sheet?
Evidently, I used my last one this morning.
Let me check.
Cover.
Yeah, he already arrived. He advised that the subject is intoxicated. 470 booking is big clear.
And I gave you two 230s and a 1500. 10-4?
30, 10-4.
10-4. I already have a 1430, but I'll figure it out.
We're at 22
I
361. Where are we supposed to
transferred
be?
it to Route 31. 10-4? Transferred to Route 31.
Up.
Okay, so the 1430 to 41, and then the 1500 to 35.
RPD, they have an officer en route. Back them up.
RPD is already arrived.
Saw that suspect run, the last time he saw him was behind the blue house. At 1620, 17th Street.
470 can take any one of those calls.
Can we give a reference to male that fell down, having chest pain? Back 215. Still coming in. Working on EMS 1 at 2126.
It's a copy.
Under Specialty Services, 8601 IH
Well, I'm going to take a 10-7 after I get the paperwork.
8601 IH 37 southbound.
Base, can I get a private real quick on 2005 when you get a minute?
Street clear, back quarters.
Right now. I can't. The other dispatcher just left with the radio.
Pinnacle,
That's right.
533s and a priority 4.
What I gave you was, I transferred that other 230 because you weren't going to make it back because you had to go to the Northwest Senior Center and go all the way to Longoria. So instead I gave you 230 because you're going to put them up into the window at a Ability House. And then a 1500 at Out and About. And then you're done.
Able to talk.
If you want another one.
Still coming in. Working on EMS 1.
No, that's good. Thank you. Appreciate it though.
49 Baldwin. 3949 Baldwin. Crushed of Cortez and Torreon. Looking for a 53-year-old male. Conscious, bleeding, pain in his side. Able to talk. Information still coming in. Working on EMS 1. 2129.
3 copy.
Adam 320, can we put him down for your
320, put in frequent patrol for the address, 10-4.
Medic 6.
470 booking driving.
922, radio check.
Loud and clear.
Back to dispatch.
922, we'll be following that vehicle to 4441 Silver Hollow.
9 transit radio check. 441 Silver Hollow.
Loud and clear.
3. 10 minutes ago,
Give the individual call now. Thank you. I'm good.
and he's going to have an ID card only that's current but not eligible, suspended for...
My racial profile, I had a couple of traffic stops, that's not updated.
Okay.
He's acting like a
I don't think it's related, but I mean, your traffic stops aren't moving over.
He came in and he was tied by his hands and legs to the bed.
You'll advise? 235.
1 of 78.
Stand by. Number 3, 2950 Santa Fe, number 3. Contact a client.
Wow,
10-4, limited to route.
it's only the security guard that wants to...
Okay, did you ever take care of the one at Anchor? Yeah, I'm working on it. Also, is there any way you could call Carolyn Wagner? I'm here at Walmart. She didn't show.
Clear, 10-4.
3 changes. 5 Bailey, 10-4.
Delta 320, advise tonight.
Inability House. 2 Inability House. Charles and Lindsay Dansfield.
370, I'll show you taking her.
Oh no, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Service 2950 Santa Fe, number 3.
There, we usually contact your son who comes and gets her.
There's another one there from Yorkshire. Go ahead and take it with you. Okay, just call it in. We'll transfer it to your route. Okay, so you're sending me everybody at the ability? Just Lindsay Dansfield and Charles Humphrey. That's all you can do. You've got Rush after that. 10-4. Don't bring any more. The only one is if the other one from Yorkshire is there, take him with you. If not, that's all. Just keep going. Okay, that's what I was checking on. Okay, thanks.
474, 10.
Go ahead. Looking for Armando Scott. Am I going to go in through Southgate or Painter? I don't remember. It's been a long time. Sure. Going through Painter.
Subject's going to be 29 out of Arizona. It's going to be in-state pickup only. He's going to have 1 MC warrant, a bench warrant for fail to maintain financial responsibility, 7/31 of 2018. And he's going to have a driver's license that expired in 2007 and is not eligible.
And when she asked her where her destination was when they got out to Robstown, the female just kind of started yelling at her. She's worried if you contact her by the radio that there may be a confrontation.
Yeah, 40, can you run 2 more? Okay, this is 1010.
Go ahead.
10-4. She's out at Robstown now. She called me by landline to advise me about this.
11288.
Senator from Ohio.
Mr. President, today, are we in the quorum call?
The Senate is in a quorum call.
I ask unanimous consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, today I'd like to report back to my colleagues here in the Senate and to the American people about the results of legislation we passed here in the United States Senate and the House was signed into law by the President. We don't do that often enough. You know, we tend to pass legislation and don't do the oversight to figure out whether it's working or not. In this case, this was legislation we passed on a bipartisan basis called the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act. We passed it back in April. This is legislation that allows the victims of sex trafficking to get the justice they deserve by being able to sue websites that traffic them online knowingly, and to be able to have some accountability for these horrible crimes that are committed online, and then also to allow prosecutors at the state and local level to be able to prosecute these cases. We drafted the legislation because after looking at this for several years, realized that there was a rise in trafficking going on, trafficking of girls, underage, trafficking of women, sometimes boys, underage, and that this was increasing primarily because of the internet, kind of the dark side of the internet. You know, we're hearing a lot about what's going on in the internet these days in terms of meddling in our elections and so on. Of all the positives on the internet, there's also a darker side, and we realized that this was happening online increasingly, and that it was a ruthlessly efficient way to basically sell people online. So we looked at it and found out that there was a federal law that was put in place with good intentions, I believe, back a couple of decades ago to try to ensure freedom of the internet, which of course all of us support, but it provided an effective immunity to these websites, even if they were selling people online knowingly. So we wrote legislation to get at that, spent about a year trying to get that through the process, and eventually got it to a vote and got it passed. The law which provided the immunity was part of the Communications Decency Act that was meant, again, to try to encourage freedom of the internet, but was taken too far, particularly in how it was interpreted by the courts. The internet was something that we had to address, because without that you would see this increase of drug trafficking and sex trafficking. So what happened? Well, after passing the law, there was a pretty dramatic change. On Monday, I was in Cincinnati, Ohio, my hometown, at a place called the Change Court. The Change Court is a place where women who are incarcerated, who are trafficked and incarcerated for prostitution, are able to go through a 2-year program to help them get clean, and if they're willing to go through this program, to let them walk away with a clean record. Understanding that sex trafficking is not a crime, that in effect they are victims of trafficking. And it's very inspiring to go there, because in that case I talked to about a dozen women who are currently in the program, some women who had graduated from the program, and the stories are unbelievable of women getting their lives back together, getting back to work, getting back to their families, in almost every case getting back to their children, because almost every case these are moms, and having the self-respect and dignity that comes with work and getting back with their families and getting their lives back on track. It's really a much, much better alternative than the system of throwing people into jail who are in effect victims of this trafficking and not dealing with their issues, whether it's the trauma or whether it's the drug addiction, which in almost every case of these women, there was a drug addiction issue. Almost all of them were opiate addicts or recovering addicts. One was addicted to alcohol, but this is just common. So anyway, in talking to these women, almost every one of them said the same thing, which is yes, they had been trafficked online. And they were very interested in this legislation because, look, they've been through it. And they want to save future women and girls from having to go down this dark path. So anyway, we passed the legislation, and the SESTA legislation meant to be able to help on this issue. And I was able to tell these women at the Change Court what the results were. And they're pretty dramatic. On Monday of this week, I also met with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC. That's the leading anti-trafficking group, really, in the country. They work day and night in trying to stop online sex trafficking. They keep track of it. They keep the statistics and the data. They particularly focus on, of course, rescuing kids from being exploited. According to NCMEC, the results since SESTA has signed into law has been swift and significant. NCMEC said, and I quote, "Since the enactment of SESTA and the government seizure of Backpage," that's Backpage.com, a website that was doing most of the commercial sex trafficking prior to our legislation. Since the enactment of SESTA and the government seizure of Backpage, there has been a major disruption in the online marketplace. The robust marketplace for sex trafficking, including the sale of children for rape and sexual abuse that took a decade to build, fragmented over the course of just a few days," end quote. They also said, and I quote, "Many sites or portions of sites where NICMEC knew children previously had been sold for sex have voluntarily shut down." Their bottom line, and I quote, "This means it is much harder to purchase a child online." This means it is much harder to purchase a child online. That's great news. And that's exactly what we intended this legislation to do, to be able to save these kids and these women and sometimes boys from being subject to this horrific crime. I will tell you there's another analysis that was shared with me recently. You can find this online, but this analysis found that online ads selling women and children have been reduced since our legislation passed by between 60 and 80%, depending on the state. Between 60 and 80%, depending on the state. Dramatic change. And again, having the effect of saving literally thousands of children. So I'm hopeful that we'll continue to be vigilant about this issue because, you know, when you push something down in one place, it often pops up somewhere else, doesn't it? But we have done an effective job at dealing with a very real problem. Backpage.com, which we talked about, was the industry leader. They have now been shut down. Their CEO and the company has pled guilty to numerous money laundering and trafficking related charges. And because prosecutors can now do their work and go after these online traffickers, and because victims of this abhorrent crime can finally have their day in court, these websites that knowingly facilitate sex trafficking are being shut down and being held liable for their action. By the way, this never would have been possible without the work of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. The staff there, the investigators, spent 2 years working on this issue, investigating it. We had to come all the way to this floor, to the chamber, in order to enforce our subpoenas, to get the information which we were able to unveil that no one else had been able to find, which showed clearly that they knew what they were doing. They knew they were selling underage kids online. So I'm very proud of those investigators. I chair that subcommittee. It's bipartisan, and they do good work, and they deserve to be applauded given the results that we're now seeing. And by the way, it's not just Backpage. A lot of other classified websites have also shut down their personal ads, so-called, or sex-related operations. The issue of sex trafficking, again, we've made good progress on, but it is so related to the issue of opioid abuse. And specifically, as I said, this goes hand in hand often. Often traffickers find people who are addicted because they are vulnerable, because they crave the drug and the trafficker can provide it. But also, many times we have found in my home state of Ohio, as I've met with survivors, that they find vulnerable people who are not addicted, but then make them addicted, so they become dependent on the trafficker. So this is an issue that relates to so many things, doesn't it? It relates to our workplace because people who are addicted to opioids are not coming into the workforce. One reason we have such high levels of unemployment, people outside the workforce altogether, they're not showing up on the unemployment numbers because they're not even looking for work. The labor force participation rate, as economists call it, is so low right now, is largely, in my view, because of this opioid issue. Our courts are jammed, our jails are jammed, our hospital emergency rooms are jammed. We have to do more to get at this issue for so many reasons. The driving force there, in my home state of Ohio, and around the country now, is this synthetic form of heroin or opioids. It's called fentanyl, 50 times more powerful than heroin. There's other drugs called carfentanil as an example, even more powerful. These drugs, these synthetic forms of opioids, are causing most of the deaths now in my state of Ohio and around the country. The Center for Disease Control, CDC, recently issued a report which showed this increase in overdose deaths involving fentanyl. The report analyzed overdose deaths in 10 states hit hardest by the epidemic, including Ohio. It found that fentanyl overdose deaths in those states nearly doubled from the last 6 months of 2016 to the first 6 months of 2017. They found that fentanyl overdose deaths in those states nearly doubled from the last 6 months of 2016 to the first 6 months of 2017. And of course, 2017 is the last year for which they have good records. It's unbelievable. This synthetic form of heroin is the new scourge of the opioid epidemic. And by the way, it's being spread into every other drug too. So when I do roundtables back home, as I do regularly, I hear about it being spread into crystal meth, into cocaine, being spread to heroin, of course. Twice in roundtable discussions I've had and with community leaders, I've heard one from a police chief, one from a sheriff, both very similar stories about a young man who wakes up from an overdose after being saved through Narcan, this miracle drug that reverses the effects of an overdose. And when the young man comes to, he says, I was just smoking pot. How did I overdose? And in both cases, based on the forensics, the information that they were able to get from the labs, they found out, of course, that it wasn't just marijuana. It was marijuana laced with fentanyl. So no street drug is safe. They can all kill you. As I've met with these first responders, community leaders, and those in recovery across Ohio, as I just did recently with a group called Prevention First, I've heard what is often brought up by those on the front lines, and that is that we would be making so much more progress right now on this war against opioids, that we've been successful here in this Congress in passing more money for prevention and treatment and recovery. Those funds are starting to be used back home, and I see it. I see the results, and there's some really exciting stuff going on. But for the fentanyl, in other words, just as we were finally making progress on prescription drugs and then on heroin, now this fentanyl comes in and is creating even more problems. It's so inexpensive and it's so pervasive. Recently in Ohio, there were 2 busts where they were able to apprehend people who were selling fentanyl and find this cache of fentanyl that they had. In both cases, it was a massive amount. Combined, just these 2 busts alone, enough fentanyl to kill half the people who live in my state of Ohio. That's how bad it is. Just last week, there was an autopsy that revealed that the death of an Ohio police chief from Kirkersville in the Columbus area was caused by fentanyl. The report said, and I quote, acute intoxication by fentanyl. It was an accidental overdose. I've told before the story about the police officer who brushed a couple of flakes off of his shirt after a bust, didn't know it was fentanyl. Those flakes were the drug. It got into his skin through his fingers. He dropped to the ground unconscious, had an overdose, and it took several doses of Narcan to save his life. Our first responders are also in much more danger now with fentanyl than they have ever been, even with heroin and prescription drugs and other opioids. Addiction has taken too many lives in Ohio, and again, fentanyl is the deadliest drug in this epidemic. There was a recent estimation by a group called the Ohio Alliance for Innovation in Population Health, which suggested that opioids are responsible for more than 500,000 years of life expectancy lost in Ohio between 2010 and 2016. Think about that. 500,000 years of lost life due to opioids in Ohio just in the 6 years between 2010 and 2016. These are often lives of young people who had great promise ahead of them, and they become involved in this opioid epidemic, and the addiction takes over, and it's more important than anything. It's more important than their family, more important than their friends, more important than their job, more important than their faith, more important than taking care of themselves, and they end up, sadly, losing their lives and all that opportunity and all the purpose that God had for them in their lives. So we need to turn the tide on this opioid epidemic. We can't do it, in my view, unless we get at this issue of fentanyl, because that's the big new scourge. And we need to look at how it's coming, why it's so cheap. Well, here's what's very interesting and might be surprising to some people. It's not coming across the border from Mexico. Or if it is, it's very little of it. That's where the heroin's coming from, about 90% of it probably. More pure than ever, more dangerous than ever. But the fentanyl, this deadly fentanyl, is mostly coming through the mail system. It's being mailed into the United States of America, mostly from overseas, mostly from China. So there are some evil scientists somewhere in China making this fentanyl and then shipping it into your community. And it's the #1 killer right now. And by the way, opioid overdose and deaths is the #1 cause of death in my home state of Ohio. And nationally, it's now the #1 cause of death, I'm told, among people under 50 years old. So it's surpassed car accidents. It's an epidemic. So how could that be, and what can we do about it? Well, there is something we can do about it. We got to be sure that the post office helps law enforcement to find these packages as they're coming in and to get these packages out of circulation so they don't come into our communities and poison our families, our children, our neighbors. We have legislation to do that. It's called the STOP Act. 1/3 of the members of the Senate have now co-sponsored that legislation. We've now had it reported out of the Finance Committee of the United States Senate. We need to get it to the floor and get it to a vote. It's really very simple. It's legislation that Amy Klobuchar, a Democrat, Minnesota, the other side of the aisle, and I have come up with that says the post office should have to do what any other carrier would have to do. FedEx, UPS, DHL, which is under law, they have to tell law enforcement in advance what packages are coming in, where they're coming from, what's in it, where it's going. And you have to provide that electronically so you can use big data to be able to sift through the millions of packages that come in and to be able to find ones that are suspect. And then immediately use sophisticated equipment to scan those and screen those and to pull, again, those out of circulation that have fentanyl. I've been to these distribution centers for these private carrier companies. I've seen how they do it. I've seen the dangerous work that the Customs and Border Protection men and women are doing, usually in a room that has significant ventilation, and they have to have masks on and gloves. They have to be very careful about it. But thank God they're there because they're saving lives. But if you send it through the mail system, that very rarely happens. We did a year-long study of this in our subcommittee, permanent subcommittee investigations I talked about earlier, and we found a number of things that were very troubling. One is just how easy it is to buy fentanyl online. But second is the fact that these drugs, when they come in through the post office, it's guaranteed delivery. The traffickers will say if you send it by FedEx or another private carrier, UPS, again, DHL and others, it's not guaranteed. But if you send it through the government agency, no problem. That's not the way it should be. And by the way, letter carriers, the mail carriers in my community, in your community, they want this fixed too, because they care about what comes into their communities. They care about the people who they serve, and they want to be sure that they're not delivering poison. They also are at risk, just like anybody else is who's anywhere in that train. I talked about the law enforcement officers, but think of the other first responders who are using Narcan to revive people. They sometimes get exposed to it. We have too many stories of kids, little kids dying from being accidentally exposed to fentanyl in a home where someone is using it. It's just dangerous stuff, so we've got to fix this. The information as to where it's from, where it's going, and what's in it, when it's put into a digital format and can be analyzed, can quickly, through incredible intelligence that our Customs and Border Protection people have, be able to determine whether that package is suspect or not. And that will make a huge difference in taking this offline, in keeping this poison coming into our communities, and ensuring that we can, in fact, begin to stop some of the poison, but at a minimum, raise the price by reducing the supply. The post office, frankly, because of the pressure that they've gotten from Congress on this over the last few years, have begun to start to look at some of this. They've begun to provide some of the electronic data based on testimony that they provided for our subcommittee just recently. They are now receiving data on about 36% of the international packages they transport into the country. Unfortunately, of that 36%, just over a third, about 80% of those packages are presented to law enforcement, 20% get lost and end up going into the system, into our communities, even though we know they're suspect. So it's very inefficient right now. It's not working well, plus some of the data is not decipherable. So we have a long way to go. Even if all 36% was being delivered to law enforcement, that would mean that 318 million international packages each year was coming in without any screening. 318 million packages. So the STOP Act is very simple. It just holds the post office to the same standard as private carriers, 100% screening, and requires that by 2020 they get all this data on all the international packages entering the United States. It's a common sense solution. It's already passed the House of Representatives recently with a broad bipartisan vote. Our committee has reported it out. We need to get it to the floor and get it voted on. If we do so, by the way, it will be signed, because the administration has already issued a statement of administration policy on it, which supports the legislation. It was actually a recommendation of the President's Commission on Opioids. It's part of the solution. Is it the whole solution? No. But it's a critical part right now to try to stop some of this new poison, this fentanyl, from coming into our communities, the #1 killer, so that we can, through treatment, and recovery and through better prevention efforts and better other law enforcement efforts, truly begin to turn the tide on this opioid epidemic. It's critical we do so for so many reasons we've talked about this afternoon. And my hope is that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will come together, at least on this issue, on the STOP Act, and say, yes, we can do something to help those in our community who are suffering, those who are dying from overdoses, those families who are looking to us and saying, what can you do to help? I run into them all the time. Today, I'm heading back to Ohio, and I know that this weekend I will be talking to people in Cleveland and Cincinnati, where I'll be in Columbus, and they will be telling me about it. This week, I was walking down the hall back to my office on Tuesday, and a young man came up to me and said, I just wanted to talk to you about something, and you know, I figured he was with the media. I wanted to ask me a question. I stopped and asked him what he wanted, and he said, I just want to tell you thank you. And he started to well up, you know, and I knew what he was talking about. I knew what he was talking about. And he was talking about a family member of his who had overdosed and died, and he was talking about the fact that he appreciates that the Congress is finally beginning to respond to this issue. As we have. In the last year and a half, we have passed legislation that is historic here to deal with this issue, but there's so much more to do. Let's make the next step getting the STOP Act enacted into law, and therefore be able to save lives and help people be able to live their God-given purpose in life. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Liquor, 4410 Leopard, 4410 Leopard.
No, roger that. All right, so you water all awesome. Okay, no, we'll stick to what the system is. Yeah, that's the only other reason why you wouldn't get his first out back, because you were already water all.
10-4, looks like we're going to be the water boy tonight.
Because 22 went from 1 to 3.
King Lincoln Robert 6472, Morgan and 15.
Sonic carry a pocket knife.
Give us more trouble.
Advising that there's a hidden alleyway that goes all the way to McKenzie off of 15th Street. That's covered by brush.
1102 South Shoreline, 1102 South Shoreline, Emerald Beach Hotel. 310 and 360, it's going to be a disturbance over a private property accident. Contact Armin in a backfield of Henry. Other vehicles will be expressed subject.
And I don't think my sailor was able to wrap it up tight is what I'm guessing. You got any thoughts on that? Yeah, I didn't know what he did. I seen him start snagging it like that, but I didn't know where did he come from or what happened. That's that first bail that I made that I sat over there and picked all of that triangle. They came over here and made it pass down, and I forgot to drop it. And then I dropped it, and we think that that's because of picking that we carry one around for a while, it starts getting kind of an oblong where I guess it bounces on that tail with it as we go along.
9252.
Adam 430.
William 4527.
William 4527.
To 435, route CDC, adult female, star mile Joe.
Starting 0 to CDC with a female, 2233.
Dispatch showed ladder 15 and medic 15 back in service in quarters.
Claimed that they saw a female get pushed into a red truck. We're waiting on manager for video.
230. I got one subject to check. Last name is Queen Union Ida Nora. Nora Ida Lincoln Adam.
The coastal Haven.
First name is Model.
Back up. There's nothing else.
Mary Adam Union Robert Ocean.
Charlie
02
Charlie 360.
20 of 66. And see if you have anything on there for staff.
10-4. 0 clear.
Add it to my call, maybe?
Okay, readvise.
An Oscar that was ran on your call.
Service on the air.
Do you have the information or?
No. Was anybody ran on that call for the disturbance of the weapon?
I went in and couldn't make contact. They asked everybody in the
Really?
car, and I tried calling.
Okay, it's related to the call that you're currently on. I'm showing Domingo Villanueva on your call. Ramiro Moreno. And that's it.
Red Chevy truck, license plate King Lincoln Robert 1741, King Lincoln Rebel 1741. Driving recklessly, hit a car and drove off, maybe intoxicated. Patrol 2 at 1337.
Maybe an hour ago or so?
Still 270 arriving in mileage 123 corners.
Found it. Stand by.
Simple. When you, after you watch the video, get back with me. 10-4 update. We also checked the hangout across the street to see if they had any contacts with, like a drunk white lady.
Melinda Reina at 613 Elizabeth. 613 Elizabeth, she's the same day trip.
Yeah, still white.
Going to 7006 Eldora. 7006 Eldora. She's at 613 Elizabeth.
1388, all around last name Mason, the Mary, Adam, Sam, Ocean, Nora. First name Elizabeth, regular spelling. Date of birth should be 123-68. 10-4, thank you. Well, yes, Lewis. 330, signal for Modern Motel. 10-4, Modern Motel.
460, I'm clear.
460, 10-4. 06 until 5 a.m. 9325.
4 Union 9, 932.
Referring to auto test, I'm clear. Adam 430. Charlie 270 ride.
Adam 430. 670 right.
Contact the RP and see if he's on his way over here. Before I located the address on Evans, I couldn't get it to verify it's not in the system yet. I'll go ahead and put you out of attention, Evans. Adam 340 traffic. Frank William 4527. What's the registration year on that and ZIV insurance? And who is the registered owner?
No. 4522 Christie.
10-4 and I guess no insurance.
Topeka 2850 Topeka.
Insurance is showing to be confirmed, but there's no effective date or expiration date on it.
10-4, thanks, man.
Adam 410, Tupper.
I dispatch 2241.
And 4. 10-15 clear, thank you.
Gently clear.
450. Omaha 286 on George, Entry Nora 7074.
bandana and pants. He's going to be at a table near the vending machines. Has a bag with him and intoxicated and yelling.
From 10-8.
Please, what's the sound of that, please?
460 traffic. GICPD dispatch.
In just a second.
And negative 29. Owner is an Alonso Trevino. It's an unknown color 1994 Chevy pickup. Last four are 4406.
Didn't see anyone. There was one area that was kind of dark and I saw someone walking by. But as for the rooftop, I don't have cameras up there.
10-4. Alright, when we get there, I may just switch over my portable to your channel and let you know more or less where we're walking. And I'll be on your channel in case you see something on the camera.
Female in a pink dress. It's going to be a female in a pink dress. That's the one who has the shoes.
27-4. This will be the 5700 block of Skyline and Copper Plate.
700 Skyline, go ahead, the plate.
Nora Young, 7016.
Young 7016.
Warrior call 983.
David Nobles, corner short 10-4.
90 or 27, do you have a number?
They just turned off at 208 from 1329, possibly headed to 440.
Zoomer Plaza, 5425 SPID. Contact Abigail.
Lincoln Frank 9075.
To have her step out.
I think.
First name spelling be Lincoln, Edward, Adam, Nora, David, Robert, Ocean, 1024 of 61, white male.
And where you parked? If you go to that right side, there's going to be a little opening that you see. Show us clear and show us at a 54 on the buggy whip, reference to disturbance. She got black longer in there.
402 buggy whip.
Only 470, I'm clear. I'll be right over there. Charles North Zebra, 474.
GICPD dispatch.
7122 Fremont Drive, Unit John 103, the city.
130-10-4. 79-10-4.
What's the location?
440 Emerald.
Delta 440, 10-4.
Yeah, but we're about to get it. I just didn't know if you want to do criminal trespass.
I definitely appreciate some of it.
You know how to give them verbal?
I'll get all the details for you.
6306 Nancy, the city. And your subject, Joseph, was negative 29 as well. 27 eligible for 24, average 54, 45 Alameda, the city.
937 Ricky.
Well, thank you.
Contacted Jennifer. 20, repeating 180-803-8320.
Front of City Hall, Staples Hut.
Adam 410, we're going to have one adult male to custody. Can I get a case number? He hasn't put it out.
253. Your case number is going to be 160-0160.
Well, be advised, he's kicking in back of my unit. 10-4.
Kicking in the back of the unit. 10-4. Adam 4.
Sorry.
13, can you show me right to the sub?
Yeah, that call's
310.
more stable. Show me this number.
10-4.
Show me your routing.
7360 red.
330 right.
All units are right.
04
5269.
CCIC, NCIC, your subject, Randall Trevino, is going to have 2 MCs. One's going to be for no driver's license. The other is going to be for failure to stop at a stop sign. His 27, not eligible due to default on installment agreements. Address is going to be city, and I did not get a return on Thomas.
Yes, sir. Myself and 1818 will be working out duty at 20 till 2 a.m.
That is clear. 1002 clear.
First, last name Galvan, first name Alexia, Adam Lincoln Edward, X-ray Ida, Adam 5805.
1023, dispatch, can I get a read on my CRI? Block 2302. Inbound. HEB.
That's possible.
10. I'll start heading towards that shot fire.
I can show you that with them. All those in the audio.
Raul telling Robert Ocean. And then let us know coming from downtown, please. 30.
Downtown, 10-4.
430 direct.
I've heard of Danny.
Okay, so she does have highly simple thing. Just advise Delta 2, they're going to be transporting. I'm going to do a paper on it. 440, copy seconds, plate, Boy George 75243.
Boy George 75243.
It's going to be more for a 1-year-old female. Reading, the lips are blue, is out of the seizure. Information still coming in. Working on fire dispatch at 2258.
Somebody should be out of me.
LD, I've got the video, so it looks like she might know him, just judging by the amount of weight that she puts up. He walks in front of the door and he pulls up real quick, kind of chases after and puts his arm around her from behind and kind of steers her back towards the car, and then he does kind of have to push her into the front seat, but he seems like he's by himself, and when she gets back in the car, she still has her cigarette in her hand. She's not trying to like fight to get out or looking like she's terrified or anything. But I mean, he does kind of he forcefully guides her back to this truck and shoves her in the car.
Charlie and
And then
Kawankawa.
takes off with her.
Boy Robert 7, David 146.
Cooper Darling Quanko, Boy Robert 7, David 146, 10-4.
Out of 140, I'll be clear. Fuel out.
What's my traffic? 20 location. There's a McCardle, Boy Adam 4, 4141. Colonel 10-4.
Be for 2 female patients. Unknown injuries. One possibly just needs a lift assist. Both are conscious and breathing. No broken bones. One hit the head. Information still coming in. Looking off EMS 12301.
Staples in Texas.
Box 380, QL, Staples in Texas, 10-4.
David, one contact out here.
3920 location.
Contact 3400 block of airline.
We're gonna have one more to get chance.
3400 Box Airlines, John William George 6903.
Neighbors 1120 of 82. Check to make sure you have the CTW at this location.
They qualify back on. 735 in line. Leopard and cross down. No assault vehicle over here. Call down plate. I'm out on that call. I'm buggy with it.
10-4, does he have CTW?
The CW for Tiffany.
McKenzie on George Boy Frank 4072.
Now on subject in front of TJ's on Warner Port. 410 is transport available.
410, that's 10-4.
I have 1 mile navigation. I'm ready.
Navigation, sir, transport 10-4.
M1, 61885. Ability, 27
10-4, I'm not sure. I don't show you logged in on my side. Where are you up there yet?
After 57.
MEChANiCAL. I'm Brownlee.
That's
1546. Oh, yeah, myself at 6425 will be out of that. Across the location from that.
There's a greenhouse. I think it's coming from over there. I don't know that. I think that's 11th Street.
We'll make a call.
Number is 162-0162. Juvenile female in custody at 2305.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent that appointments at the desk appear separately in the record as if made by the chair.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that following leader remarks on Monday, July 23rd, the Senate proceed to executive session with the consideration of the following nomination, Executive Calendar 1000. I ask consent that the time until 5:30 be equally divided in the usual form, and that following the use or yielding back of time, the Senate vote on the nomination with no intervening action or debate. That if confirmed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table. The President be immediately notified of the Senate's action. That no further motions be in order, and that any statements related to the nomination be printed in the record.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that following the disposition of the Wilkie nomination, that the Senate resume legislative session and proceed to consideration of H.R. 6147.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it adjourn until 3 p.m. Monday, July 23rd. Further, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired. The journal of proceedings be approved to date. The time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed. I ask that following leader remarks, the Senate proceed to executive session under the previous order.
Without objection.
So if there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask to stand adjourned under the previous order following the remarks of Senator Sullivan.
Without objection.
Last name, Olivares with a Z. First name, Oscar. 111075.
They're missing. They're outside on the Weber side of the complex. No apartment number given. There's going to be a female that's yelling in the background of the call. The suspect is the mother, Vanessa. Case
722 is 10-4.
We clear 5-8 from this call.
Come back negative 29 all the way around, not getting a 27 on him.
270, you have nothing but static. Shorts, cursing at the RP, possibly intoxicated.
Point 10-4. Yeah, southbound on the club. Lou and Osage, Lincoln Boy John, 5732.
David 68368, Leopard and Calico.
For Lou and Osage.
Adult females in custody at 2313.
We're in Baldwin. RP can be contacted if needed.
164-0164.
Be out at 4863 Baldwin.
Delta 140, Delta 220. It's going to be a male and a female, both on bikes, fighting with each other. Female is wearing a green shirt and maroon jacket on her waist, white female, white pants. And male's Hispanic male wearing a dark gray shirt and camo shorts.
Is there and wants to report?
No caller.
314.
The 8421 to 4.
Numbers 165-0165.
That's 10-4, she's still wanting to report.
It's outside of 3806 Holly, apartment 506. Apartment 506.
Charlie 4. Delta 140, Delta 220. RP's advising they're in front of the Fruit King on Morgan. Both possibly intoxicated in UID.
460, clear traffic.
John Lincoln Henry 4573.
John Lincoln Henry 4573. And follow 450. Clear.
Joseph, last name is spelled Queen, Union, Ida, John, Adam, Sam. First name Joseph is
Ryan,
John, Ocean, Sam, Edward, Paul, Henry. Date of birth is
155, last name
06,
Odaro.
1996.
First name is Ryan. Can you confirm spelling on our
Go ahead, repeat it.
Robert Young, Adam
Number is going to be 18080388296.
Thank you for your help.
Man, thank you. Charlie 470 to 375.
4. Contact Mary, apartment 402.
4 up. Oh, 4 tank.
It's in 4.
10-4.
440. Somebody at the service station for a minute.
440, at the service station for a minute, 10-4.
The by post offer. And it comes back to Belleville Drive.
RTA, can you get a better address? I can't find the apartment.
Delta 435 out on 1.
Delta 435, location.
Your location?
Unit the keyed up, needing to be logged in.
5516 and unit 2787.
2787.
Comfort, our ETA should be about 10 minutes. We also got an auxiliary temp of 97.5.
Yeah, I'll take the call, Morgan.
Delta 342.
Clear, show me not to make.
She's on B in the electronics. A question on the grocery side.
Delta 340, 10-4.
470, 10-4, Charlie 368, sharing Park Apartments, Charlie 470.
Delta 210, ID 1709 to 1400.
Charlie 450, signal 4.
450 location.
1000 Yorktown, Illinois.
Charlie 470.
Yeah, show me clear off this call and I'll be across the street on that attempt to contact.
Show me out of the stripe at Weber and Bratton. Got some borders.
What are their titles?
They're the victim advocates. There's 3 of them over there. They work out of the family violence unit office. And they can help with all those services.
Simple. I couldn't think of the right name.
Can you run a subject for me and,
No, since you were up there for a while. Thank you, Captain.
Nothing is driving.
20-4.
Joel, Agnes, and Port. 7025 I'll call them and check who is that. Appears to be open as well. 10-4. Bravo 410, you can hold my call and put me around to that. 10-4. At 104.1. 135 was given her 150 milligrams of Tylenol. We're going to be about 5 minutes out. 280.
FM 624 County Road 77. FM 624 County Road 77. Silver GMC KDR that hit 3 to 4 hogs on the highway.
Location.
Gonna be at Airline in Galahar on Team Lincoln, Robert 7517.
Galahar 10-4.
1B.
Transporting code 1 to Memorial, beginning mileage 0.1.
1B 10-4.
Mr. President.
Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, it's Thursday afternoon, and it's one of my favorite times of the week, and I know for many of my fellow senators, including the presiding officer and the pages, this is one of their favorite times of the week, too, because it's the time that we get to talk about the Alaskan of the Week. Now, there are people, I had a couple people today come up, hey, Senator, when are you giving your speech on the Alaskan of the Week? I saw him later, and he said, okay, well, we're going to keep an eye on it because people find a lot of interest in what's happening in the great state of Alaska. Now, the Alaskan of the Week, as many of my colleagues know, is somebody who we like to highlight, who's just done great stuff for the state, community, town, state, maybe country. Sometimes it's someone famous. But, Mr. President, oftentimes it's somebody who's been working really hard for much of their life and doesn't get a lot of recognition, just doing it. The heroes of the community. And so that's why we like to talk about the Alaskan of the Week. It's also a great opportunity to talk to people in the gallery, people watching on TV and C-SPAN, to get them to come on up to Alaska. Come on up. It'll be the trip of a lifetime. Of course, it's a gorgeous, huge state, mountains, glaciers, wildlife. But here's something else. When you get off the plane and you go to Alaska, you get the sense of freedom, liberty. You can almost breathe it in ways that you can't in other places. So I ask everybody who's watching, come on up. You'll love it. It'll be a trip of a lifetime. You'll feel that freedom in the air like you do in almost no other place in the world. So, Mr. President, let me introduce you to our Alaskan of the Week, Jeannie Follett, who has displayed incredible commitment to keep our state clean and special. All right, let's talk about Jeannie. She was born in Detroit. She moved to Anchorage when she was just 6 years old and has called Alaska home ever since. Like so many Alaskans, she's led a very interesting and varied life. She began her professional career as a court reporter for the Anchorage Daily News, our big newspaper, covering all kinds of trials when the state was still new and our court system had just been formed. Remember, we're a very young state. Eventually, she moved to Girdwood, which is a beautiful ski resort town outside of Anchorage, where she was a breakfast cook and managed condos. She got a bit restless. She packed up her 65 Mustang and drove across the country, but missed Alaska so much, she came back, home again, and then she worked on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, TAPS as we call it, that flows the billions of barrels of oil from the North Slope down to Valdez for an energy-hungry country like ours. And then she met her husband, Ken, when she was working on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. They bought and restored a lodge in a wonderful small community called Moose Pass, a warm, welcoming, and gorgeous Alaska community in the heart of the Kenai Peninsula, about 100 miles south of Anchorage. And if you're going to go fish the famous Russian River, Moose Pass is a great home base. Ken and Jeannie worked at the resort until they both retired. Jeannie always liked to keep her yard and her surroundings clean and organized, free of trash. But when her husband Ken unfortunately got sick, and then tragically she lost him over 13 years ago, Jeannie began to spend her days helping clean up the state, picking up trash on the road by her house, further and further from her home in Moose Pass. Now, Mr. President, think of this. As the snow melts in Alaska and in all sorts of weather, to this day, Jeannie laces up her hiking boots, grabs her visors, her gloves, her safety vest, drives up the highway to the spot where she left off the previous day, and she starts cleaning up the highway. Every single day. She gets out her bags, she starts walking and cleaning up trash on the side of the highway. And this highway abuts the majestic, beautiful Chugach National Forest. She guesses that every summer she spends 3 to 6 hours a day volunteering, picking up trash. Think about that. Alaska is a beautiful, pristine place. As a matter of fact, that's one of the things that when people come to visit, they're going to see. But like all states, in particular highway areas and states, you have some garbage. And so Jeannie takes action every single day, doesn't get paid. 3 to 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. She's out there cleaning up the highway. Remarkable. Sometimes friends and neighbors come and help out. Boy Scouts join her. One summer she picked up 800 bags of trash to keep Alaska clean and pristine. People stop on the side of the road to talk to her, ask where the nearest gas station is. Sometimes people donate gas money to her because, remember, she's starting where she left off the next day just to drive up the highway 40 miles to continue. So it's not just time and effort, it's actual money. She thinks her presence on the side of the highway helps motivate others. There was a story recently on KTUU, Channel 2, that's our big news station in Alaska, and she said in that story, she thinks that she's helped inspire people to help keep the whole state clean, whether it's picking up trash themselves or not throwing litter outside your car. So why does she do it? Why does she do it? Several hours a day, no pay, day after day, week after week. She does it because she loves Alaska. She wants to keep it clean. She doesn't want the many tourists. We have hundreds of thousands, really millions of tourists who come to our state to see trash when it's going to be a trip of a lifetime. She said, quote, it embarrasses me to think that tourists from the lower 48 might show up in Alaska and see trash. So I'm going to clean it up. She does it because it's her way to give back to a state that has given her so much. She also gets to see things that others don't see often, beautiful wildflowers on the road, the creeks, secret vistas. I'm sure she's seen a few bears and a lot of bald eagles and moose. She even saw a man once walking a chicken. Yes, you see everything in Alaska. A man walking a chicken. Well, Jeannie, she's found lost items on the side of the road, fishing licenses, cell phones, cameras, and she tries her best to get these back to their owners. Once she found a set of hubcaps that had contact information on it for the owner. When she called and told him she had his hubcaps, he couldn't believe it. He was tickled pink to get his hubcaps back. So, Mr. President, I think every state has somebody like Jeannie, there's no doubt. We all owe a debt of gratitude to people like her working selflessly, volunteering thousands of hours to keep our states clean like Alaska, to keep America clean. So Jeannie, thanks for what you're doing for the great state of Alaska, and thank you and congratulations on being our Alaskan of the week. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands adjourned until Monday at 3 p.m.
And then you were talking about beech tree, right? At the lighthouse. Route 31, do you have the other gentleman going outbound?
55, Robert 330985.
Let me just kind of repeat it to confirm. Charles, correction 2, Charles 4, Charles Mary 68.
No, I already ran the type. I was in line, but I went out to the vehicle and ran them.
King Frank John 6711, a gold 2013 Lexus E35 4-door that was recovered by DPS in Milo County. Gold 2, 2315.
Can you pick up at the lighthouse Mr. Mario Medin and take him outbound since you're already going to take Nicholas out there?
Unlabeled plate, the green Chevy truck.
Nah, I'm taking Nicholas. He could have Nicholas take him with Mario Medin.
My last name is...
Antelope number 41 to check a subject by the name of Alvin Shelley for 12 for assault.
Adam 410, that's negative.
Fuega, Frankie and Edward George Adam.
Charlie 210.
Senate will come to order. Today's opening prayer will be offered by Reverend Dr. Richard Gibbons of First Presbyterian Church from Greenville, South Carolina.
Let us join our hearts and minds together as we pray. Let us pray. Gracious God and loving Heavenly Father, as we prayerfully seek your presence, enable us amidst complex challenges to be refreshed and renewed by the transforming nature of your extravagant love. Impart to us a profound sense of gratitude, thankful that in your sovereign purposes we are a people conceived in liberty, shaped by adversity, dedicated to equality, while fully dependent on you, for in God we trust. Father, grant to us a renewed sense of your calling, sustained by the enduring values we hold to be self-evident. Equip us by your Spirit to be a Senate defined by consensus through compassion, expertise enlightened by experience, leadership resistant to polarization and expediency, yet intentional in unity, honesty, transparency, and integrity, as together we seek to be one nation under God. We bring our prayers to you in and through the name of Christ our Lord. Amen.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God.
21 copy.
31 copy. 16 copy.
04 copy. The event number, please.
The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., July 19, 2018. To the Senate. Under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Cindy Hyde-Smith, the Senator from the state of Mississippi, to perform the duties of the Chair. Signed, Orrin G. Hatch, President Pro Tempore.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved.
Fire dispatch at 003.
Description's going to be white beater and looks like black shorts.
Black shorts, 10-4.
31, CPS arrived.
15.
Unit asking for individual.
1022.
30.
You were calling, I guess they got the 12.
Notify the record
Asking
that
if
it's
he
going to
needed
be
to be
18
12.
and a half foot.
He's on the property right now. They don't have him in custody yet. What did you say after 18 and a half foot?
If they get him, it's going to be a 12.
It's going to be an 18 and a half foot trailer with the boat on it.
Hey, with a boat. And how big's the boat?
18 and a half foot.
10-4.
Yeah, with that ID unit at Bruce.
Location?
10-4.
Here's the 7 to the female.
307 of 83.
And the male. They're actually going to be in the red roof parking lot now. As in the male is dragging the female. The male is blessing running towards the Whataburger. The male muscle shirt, camo backpack. Female, pink shirt, shorts, blonde.
We'll be 5 with an arrest. You still need us on patrol 4?
Yep. At the tire shop. Shirt, blue shorts. It's sitting at on the sidewalk. Try to approach the RP as they walked away.
Disturbed. Whenever you're clear, you can advise
black shorts,
if
left on
you need a
foot.
D4.
Took 2 24-ounce Michelob Ultras.
I'm sorry, could you 10-9 that?
10-4, I had a unit advised that at Morgan and Staples, they are now being redirected for the outbound route. Whenever you get a chance, if you could check on it.
Numbers on Everhart?
Okay, 10-4. You said that you had 1021 coming to replace 1023?
Early 415 traffic.
415 location?
Source in Galahar on 02607 Victor 4.
He was going to be relieved at 227 at Port Air Station. I don't know if he's going to make that relief point in time.
243.
2729, 2 subjects. First, last name Sam Henry, Edward, Lincoln, Edward Young. First name Adam Lincoln, Victor Adam Nora, 102774. John Edward, Sam, Ida Charles Adam, 111076.
Madam President.
Majority Leader.
The Senate's continuing our productive summer. This week, we've been focused on confirming more of the President's qualified nominees. After his confirmation yesterday, Andrew Oldham of Texas will now bring his impressive credentials and years of distinguished public service to his new role on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Today, we're considering the nomination of Ryan Bounds to serve on the Ninth Circuit. Each of these nominees has been selected by the President and his team for their credentials, reputations, and commitment to the rule of law. Each has been thoroughly examined by our colleagues on the Judiciary Committee. Ryan Bounds is no exception. He's earned degrees from Stanford and Yale. He clerked for the very Ninth Circuit judge he's been nominated to succeed. For the past 14 years, he's distinguished himself as a public servant at the Department of Justice and in his current role as an Assistant U.S. Attorney for Oregon. Along the way, he's earned the respect and recognition of legal professionals from across the country and the political spectrum. 46 of his colleagues in the District of Oregon describe his admirable work ethic, keen judgment, masterful writing as skills that colleagues and opponents alike seek to emulate. In a letter to our Senate colleagues from Oregon, criminal defense attorneys who litigated against Mr. Bounds testified to his, quote, fairness, diligence, and legal acumen. They write he has shown time and time again that he's a man of his word. He's an excellent lawyer and would make an outstanding judge. A number of law professors from across the country seem to agree. They remind us of the standards to which this body is charged with holding judicial nominees: fairness, impartiality, intellectual rigor. To sum it up, in the words of one legal peer, Ryan has all of this and more. So, Madam President, I look forward to voting to confirm this excellent nominee and would urge all of my colleagues to join me. Speaking of excellent nominees, I'd like to speak for a moment about President Trump's outstanding choice for the Supreme Court, Judge Brett Kavanaugh. This week, even more of our colleagues have had the opportunity to meet with Judge Kavanaugh. I'm sure they'll agree that it's hard not to come away impressed. The academic achievement, the judicial credentials, the esteem of his peers and fellow legal professionals. Of course, that hadn't stopped the far-left special interest groups from grasping at straws and trying to smear this nominee any way they can. They don't seem to care whether it's honest or not. They don't seem to care whether it's accurate or not. The latest made-up controversy is an attempt this week to make hay out of comments Judge Kavanaugh made about the long-ago expired independent counsel statute. But once again, there's no there whatsoever. Here, Madam President, are the facts. Judge Kavanaugh's apparent concerns about the independent counsel law appear in line with mainstream views that have been widely held on both sides of the political aisle. Views that were, in fact, strongly held by many of my Democratic colleagues, at least until there was an opportunity to try to make political hay. Congress chose to let the statute expire back in 1999, based in large part on constitutional concerns. Let me say that again. The Congress in 1999, on a bipartisan basis, decided to let the independent counsel statute expire. My colleague, the senior senator from Illinois, the assistant Democratic leader in the Senate right now, explained this well when he was fighting any attempt to renew the statute. Here's what he said in 1999 about the independent counsel: unchecked, unbridled, unrestrained, and unaccountable. My friend from Illinois punctuated his enthusiasm for the demise of the independent counsel by saying, "I'd like to say to Judge Starr and all other counsels, your days are numbered." I agreed with him about the independent counsel statute. A number of us in both parties saw it the very same way. So we happily allowed the law to expire. This has nothing to do with special counsels. That's different from the independent counsel. The day the independent counsel statute expired, the day we actually finished with the impeachment trial of President Clinton here in the Senate, Senator Chris Dodd from Connecticut and I went upstairs and had a press conference and said we agree the independent counsel statute ought to be allowed to expire, and it did. That has nothing, Madam President, to do with special counsels or any of the other tools that are currently in place for elected officials to be held accountable. This has nothing to do with any investigations that are in the headlines today. Judge Kavanaugh was talking about was a law that has not existed for 2 decades and which the Supreme Court upheld with only a single dissenting vote. And one of the dissenters in the case that upheld the independent counsel statute was Justice Scalia. The irony, or hypocrisy, is that our Democratic colleagues are now criticizing Judge Kavanaugh because he may hold the same views on this subject that they did. Or at least they did up until Judge Kavanaugh was nominated. A view that was shared and acted upon by members in this body on both sides of the aisle, as I have explained. So another day, another off-base attack. Here's how Newsweek dismissed this tempest in a teapot. Law experts told Newsweek that Kavanaugh's view on independent counsels has nothing to do with special counsels or Mueller's probe. And in fact, the two types of federal investigations are completely different. Yet again, The far-left special interest groups who are desperate to deny Judge Kavanaugh fair treatment are hoping the media will buy their latest made-up charge. Remember the outrage when it was learned that Judge Kavanaugh enjoys baseball? My goodness. Shocking. Well, I'm proud the President has chosen a nominee as strong as Judge Kavanaugh. We should put aside these unfair attacks and misrepresentations and give his nomination the fair treatment it deserves. Now, in a final matter, this week I've discussed a number of converging reports that highlight the strength of this economy for middle-class families and job creators. U.S. retail sales just increased for the 5th consecutive month. Earlier this year, consumer confidence hit its highest level since 2000. More than 1 million new jobs already created in 2018. More job openings than job seekers for the first time in more than 15 years. Over 95% of U.S. manufacturers reporting confidence in their company's outlook, an all-time high. And just this morning, Madam President, this announcement from the Department of Labor. In the second week of July, new claims for unemployment benefits fell to their lowest level, listen to this, since 1969. All of these favorable trends are interrelated. Jay Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve, testified before our colleagues on the Banking Committee this week that, quote, robust job gains, rising after-tax incomes, and optimism among households have lifted consumer spending this month. To put it even more simply, American employers are doing better, so American workers are doing better. So American families are doing better. So American businesses are doing better. This is how a vibrant, growing economy works. This is what happens when Washington, D.C. swallows up less of the American people's money in taxes. When it imposes fewer heavy-handed regulations that make it hard to do business and get the bureaucracy's foot off the brake of our economy. This is among the best, quite possibly the best, economic moments for jobs and opportunity that Americans have seen in recent memory. The policies of this united Republican government help bring it about, and they're helping to sustain it. Earlier this week, the Wall Street Journal reported tax cuts appear to be propelling robust consumer demand. Many households are experiencing less withholding from their paychecks thanks to the tax overhaul. According to a recent survey, fewer than 1 in 5 American manufacturers now say that an unfavorable climate due to things like taxes and regulations is a primary obstacle to their businesses. 2013, during the Obama economy, more than 2/3 of the manufacturers said that. 2/3 said it was a problem. In 2013, only 1 in 5 considered a problem now. Across the country, as job creators of all sizes have announced worker bonuses, pay raises, and business expansions, many say loud and clear that tax reform is what made it possible. The American people voted, the Republicans kept our promises, so now middle-class families are seeking the effects of the pro-growth policies they asked for in 2016. And the whole world is seeing what the American people can accomplish when their government gets off their backs.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Special assignment there. So let her know we're actually going to be at South Goodwill Parkway and South Staples.
Correction on that. That was another unit that arrived at that time. Your arrival time was 2348. 2348.
Certified clear. To the suicide threats at 1722.5 Buford to those units advised. The resident is an open line for death and progress at Hibachi Grill, 5274 South Staples. Contact is Robert.
About the 320 now.
I'll show you that.
The business call in?
460. Give me the she's in a pay. Hispanic male, green hoodie. They did advise he left on foot, no direction of travel, and he was alone. Check, still on the pool?
No, they're leaving. We'll be clear.
240, 10-4.
Adam 450, can you log me out so I can log into this computer? Come back to the left here, right next to you, where there was a gap, so I didn't have to back up, but I don't know if I may have missed it by 6 rows, it looks like. I think it's be 6 more rows over, but that's what I was trying to do, is make a circle here and point into this well pad. Okay, yeah, I cut those curvy things out of the way just so, I don't know if I got to roll off of them curvy things or not, but just pick them all out of the way and then we can figure out where our six is again.
And hit her and choked her.
Yeah, once we get over there, we can figure it out when we jump the road every time.
In a black shirt and pants short.
Fine. Yeah, when he jumps, it's like a,
That's the location. That would be
yeah,
the
well, we got plenty of room to make a turn now. I'll turn back, I'm going to turn back to my left, and then you can go ahead and start skipping. We got plenty of room on this pad now to make turns. Okay, I'll turn you on the end.
180-4, 5600 Ricardo, pulling into Burlington 10-4. Listed grandmother's location. We're going to have Sunrise Avenue. Contact is made. Authority M320 1432. Medics, the call's still being updated. There's no Delta 4, Delta 3. Delta 4, 10-4.
Round 27 showing eligible expires 20. I just had a Rio Grande City.
I'm sorry, right now we're running real tight. Everybody's running tight, but let me see what you have.
Sunrise, 2905 and a half, Sunrise. They're requesting EMS reference someone that they're having a disturbance with. Information still coming in. Go ahead and stage for scene safe. Working off fire dispatch at 039.
Call it Staples and Weber. Do you want to dispatch a unit or just make it bolo?
Yeah, you just bolo it. 375, you get a case number?
Number's 30003. Here's confirmation for fireworks, Staples and Weber, general area at 1241.
And the call for all the impound?
Were you asking about which one?
It's the 1430 at 3318 South Alameda Street.
B77 southbound County Road.
You close enough to let an employee in that forgot her keys?
What was that?
You let an employee in that forgot her keys.
Do a Nueces for a recovered stolen vehicle.
10-4, you just hold it, and I believe they're taking it to the...
Came back negative 29 all the way around. I didn't get a 27 on it.
Try that?
Yeah, that'll be it. 26, King Tom 1257.
10-4. Static, building 26, King Tom 1257. Ethan?
358 eastbound, taking the Flower Bluff exit, Adam Mary 9, 3337.
The eastbound, taking the Flower Bluff exit 10-4.
440 case number.
DPS on scene, please.
410-4.
Requesting a cancel.
450, did you want contact?
Negative, not requesting. 06.
037, can you add Charles Robert 9, Frank 043 to the call?
7810-4.
Can you tell us if that plate has insurance, please?
10-4. 44, Georgetown Boy 2037, insurance is confirmed.
I'm getting a 29 hit for an Alfredo. Gonzalez with an O, Ocean on the end. There's 2019-90, 29 Nueces County for a traffic offense.
Route 35.
That's 4 social. 35, come in.
Cancel Alicia de La Paz.
10-9. What was the warrant for?
Cancel Alicia
Traffic offense,
de La
failure to
Paz.
appear on a traffic offense.
I can't hear the name correctly. Say it again for me one more time. Alicia de La Paz. Downplay to be Charles X-ray 10-4. 472.
10-4.
10-4. Can I please confirm and fax that, please?
431.
Morty, go ahead.
Holly, the information still coming in work on 5. Dispatch 1436.
Elisa Ann Drive, 3826 Elisa Ann. Contacted Nicholas Flores.
Rhonda Alvarez?
With the girlfriend Aaliyah, 23.
I don't have a Rhonda Alvarez. And I called and called and called her back, and she never got back with me. I don't have an MDT.
6255, can you confirm insurance on that for me?
Straight.
2 minutes, 10-4.
William 6619.
Where is she at?
The Gypsy store in Alameda. So if you can swing back and go get her, please. You're the only one that fit it on your rat man, please. I don't have nobody else.
Yeah, but she called me, and then I tried getting back with her, and she never called me back.
Again, if
I'm on my way.
the second, I need to adjust the name on the call and run a weapon.
7 showing not eligible. Expires in 20 due to default on installment agreements. Address 6225 Saratoga.
23. I have him on a detour. They switched the traffic pattern over.
So what you need to change?
The name I need to change is for Lori Polito. Last name, spelling is going to be Paul Union Lincoln.
Top off paperwork to legal.
Ocean. And first name is going to be Lincoln Ocean Robert Ida. Date of birth should still be the same of 1/27/1991.
It looks like the inbound detour is going to be clear. I got to double check on that.
Your way, 10-4.
10-4.
Inbound Gulf Breeze, 4621 Gulf Breeze. Cross you to Breeze and Golden. Here for a 52-year-old male. Breathing, has high blood pressure, sweating. Won't wake up. Information still coming in. PD's been never asked, working on EMS 154.
First name is Tom Adam Robert, Young Nora, 33 of 89. Outbound only.
On the way, don't that advise?
Right, I'll go ahead and call it. How long is that going to be for, do you know?
Not the shots heard pending, Staples in Alameda.
I don't. I need to
Fajitaville, an alarm call,
make
and a
contact with the crew.
suspicious on Sabina.
Alright, 10-4. So off of Morgan. I'll go ahead and call it out.
Adam 430. Yeah, I just had that 23 that was about to get stuck. So I put him on that detour. It looks like he's clear all the way through.
Where does 420?
All the way around, no 27, return on him.
Immediately.
It's an ID card expired 23.
Be taking a right on
2625 Waterloo.
a left on Buford, a left on 10th, and a right on Morgan, back to regular route. All route 23 is outbound.
Wait, Tom 3, William 315. 450 show up on that suicide call yet?
What are you on seeing? What's up for?
Davis, 9851.
10 for David Henry Gate, 9851. Entrance is confirmed. Northern and Boston, 10-4. 075, 10-4.
Yes, sir.
Dispatch out there to back up Ruben on a suicide subject. Can you take my
Rapid Smith for release.
480 still on the island?
10-4.
Appreciate it. Dispatch on mobile. Hey, Kenner, before you take my half on that suicide.
1103, 1102, go ahead. He wants you to public service in. He's on patrol 1.
Return on him.
Oh, stop. 430.
fuel, first name David, date of birth 10/14/71. Staples 608 South Staples, contact MECA.
And EMS out to shoreline for a male 20 that's probably going to have a panic attack. He is sweating profusely.
ID that expired in 2000. Are you going to be inside or outside the restaurant? To Alvin, Texas.
Outside front doors.
Stand by for that CCW check. It's going to be at the Hibachi Grill.
And we're trying to get information from him, but he's not very helpful.
Who was they sending them to get there?
10-4. Insurance on the vehicle for me?
Yes.
Henry William Frank 0492.
Signal 121 North Shoreline, 121 North Shoreline at the Waterburger on Shoreline. To be for a 20-year-old male, sweating, possibly having a panic attack. We'll be at the front door. Information still coming in. Okay, I'll fire dispatch at 1 up.
27. It expired back in 99. The current status is not clear. Suspended for surcharge due for no insurance, 118 of 07.
That's 140, 10-4.
420.
Show us out of service.
King Adam Henry, Lincoln Adam, first name John, common spelling, date of birth 22 of 86.
Should be taking your call.
340, 2900 Delta Holly. Bravo 430.
So one adult male, 358 clear.
Adult male in custody at 104. Your case number is going to be 80008.
Robert Henry, 511.
Madam President,
Democratic Leader,
are we in quorum?
we are.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Now, Madam President, in the 3 days since the President returned from his humiliating display of obsequiousness in Helsinki, he has offered numerous explanations for his behavior. First, he said the media was too focused on the negative, and that his summit with Putin was a great success. Then, admitting there was in fact a problem, he attempted to walk back some of his comments. But he even couldn't commit to that, ad-libbing that other people could also be responsible for interfering in the 2016 elections. A mere 24 hours later, the president was back to claiming that it wasn't his fault, the media was biased. And then astoundingly, the president hadn't learned his lesson, because astoundingly, when he asked yesterday whether Russia was still attacking our election system, the president replied, no. This was, of course, followed by yet another implausible clarification in which, surprise, his press secretary told reporters that's not what the president meant. Although when you actually looked at the tape, it was clear as a bell it was what the president meant. He was saying that Russia was not still attacking our election system. Once again, disbelieving all of the fine men and women who labor quietly, diligently in our intelligence agencies who have reported this. The constantly shifting, insincere, and thoroughly unconvincing explanations for the president's performance reveal that his president and his team do not understand the depth of President Trump's blunders with Putin. And frankly, any post hoc clarification cannot substitute or repair the president's failure to confront Putin face to face. All his walkbacks, which then get undone, but all his walkbacks are done in the wrong place at the wrong time. Where's this man who prides himself on being strong, afraid to say these things to Putin, and he has to wait till he's 6,000 miles away to say them? Unbelievable. One of the most stunning things about the summit was the president's openness to a request by President Putin to question former United States Ambassador to Moscow, Michael McFaul, and other Americans. In Helsinki, the president described the request as part of, quote, an incredible offer, unquote. The president's spokeswoman was asked about it yesterday. She confirmed the president and his team would discuss it. That President Trump would even consider handing over a former U.S. ambassador to Putin and his cronies for interrogation is bewildering. No president should have the power to gift-wrap American citizens, let alone former ambassadors, to our known adversaries. How can President Trump and his team spend even a moment considering Putin's request? How can they equate the democracy and rule of law and system of open and fair prosecution we have in this country with what Putin does? Just amazing. This president every day demeans the United States. So many Americans are saying they're ashamed to have him as their leader when he behaves like this. Certainly, if the president agreed to such a request, Congress must do everything in its power to block it. There can be no room for debate, no room for discussion. We must be clear and clear quickly. So this morning, Senator Menendez, Senator Schatz, and I plan to offer a simple resolution that states, quote, it is the sense of Congress that the United States should refuse to make available any current or former diplomat, civil servant, political appointee, law enforcement official, or member of the armed forces of the United States for questioning by the government of Vladimir Putin. This body must agree on the importance of protecting our ambassadors. We should pass it today, not wait, not show any equivocation. This incredible offer, as President Trump so casually and incorrectly called it, raises other serious questions. What else has President Trump agreed to behind closed doors? What else has he discussed with President Putin? President Trump and President Putin met for nearly 2 hours behind closed doors, no one else present but a translator, and hardly anyone knows what was said. Has Secretary Pompeo been briefed on that private, behind closed doors meeting? Nobody knows. He hasn't said so. Does our military know if President Trump made commitments about our nuclear arsenal? Nobody knows. Defense Secretary Mattis hasn't said whether he's been briefed.
27 showing eligible, expires 19.
Do we know if President Trump made commitments about the security of Israel or Syria or North Korea or any of the other issues the President said he discussed with Putin? It is utterly amazing that no one knows what was said. This is a democracy. If our president makes agreements with one of our leading, if not our leading adversary, his cabinet has to know about it, and so do the American people. These questions and more need a full and complete account before Congress in an open setting as soon as possible. That's why I've called on the Republican leadership to demand that Secretary of State Pompeo, Ambassador Huntsman, and crucially, the translator present at the closed-door session be made to testify before the Senate. They should come immediately. Now. What are our Republican friends waiting for? Because, Madam President, the events of this week raise serious questions about the President's ability to responsibly and safely conduct this nation's foreign policy, about his ability and willingness to defend the United States and her citizens, about his very ability to govern in so many areas. Confronted with these grave questions, I believe the Senate must act to show our country's resolve to punish Putin for his interference and never allow such a thing to happen again, to ensure the President is doing what's necessary to stand up for American interests. I have proposed, many of my colleagues on this side of the aisle have proposed, a bunch of things we can do right now to take action in the wake of President Trump's indefensible summit with President Putin. Democrats are not in the majority. We don't control the floor. We need our Republican colleagues who control the Senate floor to join us on these measures. The lack of action, not just words, the lack of action by our Republican colleagues is stunning and deeply disappointing. Not just to Democrats, but to all the American people. Since Monday, sadly, we haven't seen movement from our colleagues in the majority. Just more slow walking. I understand my friends, Senator Coons and Flake, are working on introducing a resolution to support the consensus of our intelligence agencies and to request congressional oversight. We're all for it. I hope it passes with unanimous consent that it deserves. But my Republican friends can and must do more. Actions, not just resolutions and statements of disapproval. We shouldn't need this resolution. The things asked for in this resolution should have been happening already. And the burden of patriotism, of protecting America's security is on Leader McConnell's shoulders. I know he has a difficult situation. I know he has a president who can sometimes be vindictive. But the bottom line is our country's security, our country's direction, our country's honor demands it. We need to bring Secretary of State Pompeo, Ambassador Huntsman, and the rest of President Trump's national security team from Helsinki, including the translator who was present in the one-on-one meetings with Putin, right here before the Congress in open session, so we all know what happened. We need to pass legislation to protect Special Counsel Mueller. There's bipartisan legislation already, passed out of the Judiciary Committee under Senator Grassley's leadership and support. It's on the floor. What is our leader, our Republican leader, waiting for? We need to see the president's tax returns, the common practice of all presidents in recent memory, but needed far more now, because one of the most logical explanations of the president's obsequious and almost inexplicable actions towards President Putin is that Putin has something over him. Maybe it would be revealed in the tax returns, and if nothing's there, the president should have no problem releasing them. We need to implement sanctions against Russia, not weaken them. We need to demand that Putin hand over the 12 Russians indicted for election interference. And we need to harden our election infrastructure so that what happened in 2016 never happens again. These are all common sense measures. Most of them have bipartisan support already. And they will accomplish for America what the president has been unwilling or unable to do. If my Republican colleagues refuse to pursue any, if not all, of these items, they are de facto consenting to the president's capitulation in Helsinki. They cannot stand by. The American people won't allow it. Finally, Madam President, on health care. Ever since Republicans were handed the keys to both houses of Congress and the White House after the 2016 election, they've engaged in a protracted campaign of sabotage against our health care system. Premiums are going up, coverage is going down, and it's all falling in the laps of our Republican colleagues in the House and Senate. President Trump and congressional Republicans proposed legislation that would have gutted Medicaid, allowed insurers to charge more, and deny coverage just because a person got sick, and excluding critical benefits, imposing lifetime or annual limits on care. Under the cover of night, Republicans dismantled the health care's coverage requirement without putting anything in its place. The Trump administration canceled a federal program that helped low-income customers afford insurance and expanded the availability of junk insurance plans that sucker Americans in with low premiums but then hardly cover anything. And people are saying when they have these plans, why did I even buy insurance? But they were duped. Now, worse yet, the administration has directed the Justice Department to stop defending the constitutionality of protections for Americans with pre-existing medical conditions, turning its back on the most popular and humane advancement in our healthcare system over the decade. I'd say to my Republican friends here, go to your constituents, ask if someone has someone sick in their family. You'll get a lot of hands. And then ask them if they should be excluded from gaining insurance. Health insurance to help that sick member. See how many support these ideas. They try to do them in the dark of night. It's not going to work. In August, we Democrats are going to be talking about this over and over again. And believe me, it'll probably be the most important factor in the 2018 elections, as the American people will rebel from the taking away of health care. Imagine going back to the days when a mother with a child who has cancer can no longer find affordable health care for her daughter. When hardworking Americans who fall on hard times are made to suffer, denied health care coverage precisely because they need it. How wrong, how backward, how immoral. Well, that's where President Trump wants to take us, and that's where all of our Republican colleagues seem to be following. Later this morning, actually right now, a group of Democrats are announcing about how we plan to fight back against this lawsuit that the Trump administration has put in place and preserve the protections for up to 130 million non-elderly Americans with pre-existing conditions. The elderly, fortunately, since we still have Medicare, despite efforts by some on the other side to cut it back, are protected. As millions of Americans watch their health care costs go up, as they read about the news about the Republican latest effort to undo health care protections, they fear for the future and wonder who in Washington will be fighting for them. In November, they'll have a chance to vote for a party who will check the president's dangerous health care sabotage, who will work to bring down costs, improve quality, who will never undermine the protections of Americans with pre-existing conditions. I look forward to the response to my colleague's announcement of our lawsuit. I yield the floor.
Anybody can help her out with that?
I did.
Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination to Judiciary, Brian Wesley Bounds of Oregon to be United States Circuit Judge for the 9th Circuit.
Okay, great. Do you know what time they get there in the afternoon? It's been a while since I've gone over there.
It's going to be for a 64-year-old patient. Conscious breathing.
Okay, thanks.
Left side is numb. No difficulty breathing, no chest pains. Working on fire dispatch at 148.
13 around. Arriving Bay, Indy Miles 6.6.
Conscious breathing.
10-4, just connect to my train.
The last one or all three?
All three of them. Last name is going to be Ramirez. Last character Zebra. First name Fabian. Date of birth 071090.
For PI 27 showing
905, 10
not eligible, expired 15, has an ID card that expires 24 hours.
EM72 out, or is there any, another road monitor out yet?
I don't believe 72 has gone to an 8 yet.
10-4, that's what I needed to know. Thank you. I already contacted
contacted 72. I just didn't know if anybody else had come in.